right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line, I've got Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine, senior editor there. And here in a little while, we're going to be talking with Matt Welch. You know, I don't think I've ever interviewed Matt Welch before. But I like it. It's the case against Trump by Welch and the case against Biden by Sullum. So we'll start with you, Jacob. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing great. Really appreciate you joining us on the show here. And you're such an expert on the drug war and all this. I could tell by reading this thing that you knew most of this off the top of your head before you went back and wrote it. But
you know what? I actually, I have been following it for a long time, but I had to dig back into it to find quotes from Biden going back to the 80s. And I was actually shocked all over again.
Yeah.
By how vociferous he was in prosecuting the war on drugs. I mean, I knew that as a general matter, but when you see what he was actually saying at the time, it's really striking, especially given his current stance.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so, yeah, I mean, let's start with that then and really work on that. One of the things you point out here is his alliance with Strom Thurmond, and this is something that Bronco Marchtich wrote about in his book, Yesterday's Man, where Biden spent the whole 80s allied with Strom Thurmond, who was, I guess, to the right of Jesse Helms, right? He was the most right-wing congressman out of all of them, the former Dixiecrat, in order to attack Reagan from the right through the 1980s for being weak on crime and drugs.
Yeah, and this was a consistent stance for Biden. And I mean, it's hard to say how much of it was sincere and how much of it was his attempt to neutralize the crime issue for Democrats. I think it's some of both. He does seem to be, if you look at the old videos of him talking on the Senate floor, he seems to be sincere in talking about the need to crack down harder, to have more prison space, send more people to prison for longer periods of time. But at the same time, what he's consistently trying to do is show that Democrats can be tough on crime too. In fact, they can be tougher than Republicans.
Right.
So back when George H.W. Bush waved a baggie of crack on national television, you might remember that, and announced yet another another surge in the war on drugs. Another escalation in the war on drugs. Biden had a televised response where he said, they're just not tough enough. You need to be tougher.
Right.
I don't think they're taking this seriously enough. This is he called it the number one threat to national security, i.e. the fact that people use drugs that he doesn't approve of. And, when he was touting various crime bills that he's been involved in over the years, he was indignant at the idea that Republicans tried to make the crime bills tougher. This is a line that you will often hear from people like Bill Clinton nowadays, that, we didn't really want to do all the mandatory minimums and death penalties. The Republicans insisted on it. And Biden at the time was like, no way, this is all mine. We need to be tough. And if you look at him talking about that, and this is over and over again, this is not a one-time deal, this is over decades, he is presenting himself as tougher on crime and tougher on drugs than the Republicans, actively involved in all of the major and minor crime bills during that period, as he has proudly pointed out over and over again. There is a clip of him, I think in the early 90s, talking about crack, and he holds up a quarter and he says, we decided that this was such a bad deal, that crack was such a bad deal, that if you're caught with this much of it and he explained that he meant the size of a quarter, not not 25 cents in crack, that you get a 5-year mandatory minimum. That's regardless of whether you were involved in distribution. So any crack user caught with a small amount of crack, if he's charged under federal law, he would get a 5-year mandatory minimum. Now you watch it, and I actually had to go back and recheck because people might say, well, maybe he was expressing dismay at that that penalty. Maybe he was saying we went too far, but no, it's very clear in context. He was bragging about that.
Right. Oh, and he's going off too in that footage. I've seen that footage where he's making a real big show out of the whole thing.
Yeah,
for sure.
He was constantly getting really indignant at the idea that Republicans were tougher on crime and drugs, and that was just to illustrate that he was for real on this issue.
Yeah.
So, of course, in retrospect, at the time, a lot of us were saying that is completely absurd. I mean, even if you support the war on drugs in general, the idea of giving a user a 5-year mandatory minimum is completely insane.
Right.
And yet he thought that was the right policy. And basically, you couldn't be too tough on drugs.
Yeah. It's interesting. Somebody's got to coin it. Maybe it's the Hillary Clinton effect, especially in foreign policy, where if you're a Democrat, you got to be an extra warmonger, and especially for a female, you got to prove how muscular your foreign policy is. It's that same kind of thing for Joe Biden and crime. That you can't call me a namby-pamby liberal soft on criminals. I say Reagan's not tough enough. How do you like that? And that whole thing just for exactly the very wrong political reasons where, if the right wing is so bad they're making you do this, why not fight them and tell them no instead of outflanking them and giving in? But, because he's bad, that's why.
Well, as I say, I don't think it was purely strategic or purely political. I think he sincerely believed this stuff at the time.
Yeah. No, but I'm just talking about that aspect of it.
Yeah.
That aspect of it.
It's a combination of those two things.
Right.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it was politically important. And the 1994 crime bill is a great example of that, where Bill Clinton and the Democrats are trying to outflank the Republicans on crime. And Biden was bragging about that bill until very recently.
Hey, y'all, here's the thing. Donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show, and you can get a QR code commodity disc as my gift to you. It's a 1-ounce silver disc with a QR code on the back. You take a picture of it with your phone, and it gives you the instant spot price and lets you know what that ounce of silver is worth on the market in Federal Reserve notes in real time. It's the future of currency in the past, too. CommodityDiscs.com, or just go to scotthorton.org/donate. Hey guys, Scott Horton here for expanddesigns.com. Harley Abbott and his crew do an outstanding job designing, building, and maintaining my sites, and they'll do great work for you. You need a new website? Go to expanddesigns.com/Scott and save $500. Hey guys, check out Listen and Think audiobooks. They're at listenandthink.com and of course on audible.com. And they feature my book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, as well as brand new out Inside Syria by our friend Reese Ehrlich, and a lot of other great books, mostly by libertarians there. Reese might be one exception, but essentially they're all libertarian audiobooks. And here's how you can get a lifetime subscription to Listen and Think audiobooks. Just donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show at scotthorton.org/donate. Well, first of all, I wanted to mention, and I just happened to remember, I'm sure you know this, but I wanted the audience to know that when Bush Sr. held up that bag of crack in his big speech, that the DEA had just set up one of their informants to come and bring some drugs, and they prosecuted him. And
yeah, well, as I recall, they had to lure him into the park. I forget the name. Is it Lafayette Park? That's right near the White House. Yes, they had to lure him to Lafayette Park because he never dealt drugs there, and he didn't even know where it was.
Right.
And they did this precisely so that Bush could go on TV and say, right across the street from the White House,
right,
there are people dealing, this evil substance.
And then instead of turning him loose afterwards and saying thanks for playing your role in our little skit, they put him in jail, even though he would work for them. He was one of their guys.
Yeah. So,
and then somebody criticized Bush for that, and he goes, "Oh, what? There's a bunch of advocates for this drug guy. What drug guy? He was an informant, man." Anyway,
yeah. So
just goes. It's just. I mean, it's really perfect, right? Like even to do their little skit, the drug war's a farce.
And so take that, and the level of hysteria that was embodied in Bush's speech, right?
Uh-huh.
And then Biden goes on TV and says he's not going far enough. He's not being tough enough.
Right.
Right. So he's always going to one up the Republicans when it comes to being mindlessly punitive.
Right. Tell us about the 1984 Crime Control Act. What a great year for a Crime Control Act. I think, this is just one aspect of it I really like and feel like commenting on. Everybody knows, right, that in the federal system, there's no parole. Why is that? Joe Biden.
Yeah. Right. So that was one aspect of that bill. It eliminated parole, the idea being you basically serve the sentence that you're given, which appealed to a lot of people at the time, regardless of how draconian the sentence is. And you can currently you can get some time off for good behavior, but not very much. And there's no parole at all. So that was one aspect of it. The bill also expanded civil asset forfeiture, basically gave birth to this system where the cops can take your property simply by alleging that it's connected to crime in some way, and then the burden is on you to prove. Well, even at the time, there wasn't even an innocent owner defense as it exists now. But currently, you have to prove you didn't know about the alleged criminal activity, or if you did know about it, that you did everything you reasonably could to stop it, which essentially means you have to prove your innocence. And that's obviously it turns traditional notions of guilt and innocence on their head. But also, the burden's on you to do this. So it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's complicated, and very, very often the process costs more than the property is worth. So you find that most cases go unchallenged, and the drug warriors would say, well, it shows they're guilty. It doesn't show they're guilty. It shows that they looked at this and said, this is not worth the amount of money it's going to cost to challenge it, with no guarantee that you're actually going to win. So that the seeds of that were from the 1984 bill.
Which, by the way, I got to work in one more thing there, too, is that in recent years, I probably learned this from you at Reason, that in recent years, the government seizes more in asset forfeiture than all the burglaries and robberies in the country combined.
Yes, and it is. I mean, this is a form of legalized theft, right? If the cops did all this without the laws that Biden favored, it would be very clear that this was theft. In any case, he had no qualms about that, and there's a clip of him from I think the early 90s bragging about this, how great they can take everything you own. This is a wonderful crime fighting tool. So that was in that bill. Yeah. It also established the U.S. Sentencing Commission and created what were at the time mandatory sentencing guidelines.
And that was the first time that they came up with the mandatory minimums?
Well, the statutory minimums came in later in a series of bills, but in effect, these are mandatory minimums because at the time, judges had to follow the guidelines. Through a series of Supreme Court decisions later, the guideline sentences became optional, so judges could depart from them. The statutory minimums still apply. So, but this really started the whole ball rolling on mandatory sentences. And together with abolishing parole, the whole idea being that we want people to go to prison for long periods of time. We don't want them to get out. And no sentence is too severe. That was the general, to be fair, it was the general consensus in Congress at the time. But Biden was a leader of that movement, very enthusiastic leader. And he was still bragging about the 1984 bill. When he was vice president, he was saying this is a great example of bipartisanship, working with Strom Thurmond on this bill. Yeah. So this isn't any second thoughts he's had are very recent development, and his current positions, are dramatically different from what positions he took back then. But even the positions that he was defending just recently, in recent years. Mm-hmm. So there followed a whole series of bills that he was very heavily involved in that kept upping the penalties, creating new enhancements, new mandatory minimums. The bill establishing, 86, that was the bill that established this distinction between the smokable and snorted forms of cocaine, right? Between cocaine powder and crack, and the way they set the weight thresholds implied that crack was 100 times worse than cocaine powder, because to trigger the various mandatory minimums, the amount of cocaine powder you needed was 100 times more than the amount of crack. And this made absolutely no sense, because these are just two different ways of consuming the same drug. But it's kind of hard to recapture the amount of hysteria at the time, but it was reflected in Bush's TV speech and Biden's response. And again, to be fair, at the time that this was established, a lot of black politicians went along with it because they thought this is going to help their communities get rid of the crack dealers.
Right.
But it turned out that since federal crack offenders were overwhelmingly black, they were getting substantially more severe sentences than the cocaine powder offenders who were more likely to be white or Hispanic. So you have a situation where people committing essentially the same crime, two different forms of cocaine, same amounts. One of them, who happens to have darker skin, is getting a substantially more severe penalty than the other. And that became clear early on, within the first few years, and then black politicians started to turn against it. And Biden eventually turned against it, but not fully until 2007 or so.
Yeah, I like how you say here, 16 years later, he admitted, oh, oops, well, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, 16 years later, he was saying, we might, I think the exact phrase was, we might not have gotten it right. But by the early 90s, people were saying we really need to reform crack sentences. And he did not get on board until years later. And then in 2007, he introduced, this is when he was seeking the 2008 presidential nomination. Mm-hmm. And he introduced a bill that would have eliminated the distinction, so that crack and cocaine powder would have been treated the same. That still has not happened. There was a law that was passed in 2010 that reduced the disparity. So it went from a 100-to-1 ratio, which was completely insane, to an 18-to-1 ratio, which is also totally irrational, but slightly less insane. Yeah. And so, but
well, ironically, his son Hunter smoked $1 million worth of cocaine and strippers in about a year or so. It was the money that he got from Burisma. That was where it all went to, was the smokable kind, and that's just fine. Oh, you know what? My son, he had a problem and he overcame it, and I'm proud of him, says Biden in the recent debate, while people are buried alive in these prisons under his policies for the exact same things. Same things.
Yeah, so now, I guess given the general theme of this discussion, I shouldn't be too charitable to Biden, but one might speculate.
Go ahead, you can, because I agree with him about his son has the right to be a crackhead and get over it. But it's just, how come that doesn't apply to everybody else?
Well, now it is possible that experience played a role in changing Biden's thinking. I don't know if that's true, but you have seen cases like that, where somebody either gets addicted, himself, or has somebody close to them, and they realize this should not be treated as a crime, right? Let alone the kind of crime you can go to prison for 5 or 10 years for. So that's possible, but of course, strategically, politically, he also had a very strong motivation to change his positions on crime and criminal justice, because public opinion in general has shifted dramatically since then, and especially within the Democratic Party, right? You cannot run as a drug warrior, nowadays. Biden, as he was back then, could not possibly have gotten the nomination now. Yep. So there are very strong political reasons for him to change his position. Now he says we should abolish mandatory minimums. Back then he was bragging about them. Now he says we should abolish, the scores of death penalties. And back then he was bragging about those. And now he says people should not go to prison or should not go to jail simply for using drugs. Back then, he was a big supporter of that notion. I mean, he explicitly said we have to go after drug users.
He still won't promise, though, to legalize pot on the federal level, right?
Right. His position is states should be allowed to legalize, and people shouldn't go to jail merely for possession. But he says he's still thinking about whether repealing federal prohibition is a good idea. He thinks marijuana might be a gateway drug, and he wants more evidence about that. Now, I should just...
And by the way, under the law, isn't it correct, Jacob, that he could, quote unquote, reschedule pot by himself? That's the authority he has already been delegated by Congress on this issue, correct?
Technically, the Controlled Substances Act gives the Attorney General the authority to reschedule drugs, including marijuana, move it from one schedule to another. And the Attorney General has delegated that authority to the DEA, and there's a process involving consultation with the Department of Health and Human Services, that they're supposed to go through when they want to reclassify a drug. I think the problem is that the Controlled Substances Act probably does not allow the executive branch, to deschedule marijuana completely, because it refers to international anti-drug treaties that require some kind of regulation, right? So it's clear that they could move marijuana from Schedule 1 down to a lower schedule. It's less clear that they can unilaterally take it off of schedules entirely. That seems to require an act of Congress. But the point isn't whether Biden can do it all on his own. The point is, does he continue to support marijuana prohibition? And the answer is yes, he does. And this idea about marijuana being a gateway drug, this is a claim that goes way back, at least to the early 50s, when Harry Anslinger was talking about, he used to talk about how you use marijuana and then you become a murderer. And then he stopped talking about that because it wasn't so convenient. Once it had been banned, and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which he ran, was in charge of this and supposed to be taking care of it, talking about all the murder and mayhem caused by marijuana, might have made him look bad. And it also annoyed prosecutors, by the way, because they would get these cases where people would say, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, it was the marijuana that made me do it. And the prosecutors were very annoyed by that. So Anslinger switched from saying that marijuana makes you violent to saying marijuana turns you into a heroin addict. That you start with the marijuana and then you don't get the same thrill anymore, and you move on to heroin. So he was saying this in the early 50s, and this is what Biden is still worrying about now. There's been a tremendous amount of research on this subject. So the idea that he's calling for more research is absurd. The basic problem is you cannot ever definitively resolve the issue because you can't do a controlled experiment. And so if he's waiting for definitive proof in the sense of a controlled trial where you take babies and randomly assign them to either get marijuana or not and see how many of them become heroin addicts, right, that's never going to happen. So by saying he's waiting for definitive evidence concerning the gateway effect, he's saying he's never going to support repealing prohibition.
Yeah, and meanwhile, law of prohibition is not a magic wish, and clearly it doesn't do a thing to diminish the supply of pot or heroin in this country whatsoever. So gateway effect or not, anybody who wants a bag of weed can get one. So what difference does it make at that point, other than you could be potentially ruining the life of someone who actually didn't do anything to anyone? He just got a bag of weed. Anyway,
right. But yeah, so look, he has moved quite a ways from the positions he was taking in the 80s and the 90s, and also in the first, in the aughts as well. I mean, he was still introducing drug legislation at that point. Yeah. I mentioned in the article the Anti-Rave Act, which was designed to go after the scum, as he called them, who throw raves because people use drugs at those things, and that's not right.
Yeah. Kids dancing with neon lights. Oh no!
So he passed. He wrote this law that was designed to crack down on basically rave promoters, but really any kind of event where people use drugs. And if you can show that the people who sponsored that event had reason to know that there was going to be drug use going on, I mean, that's pretty much any rock concert, really, then you can fine them, forfeit their property, send them to prison. So, and he didn't put a lot of thought into that, because one of the very first uses of that law was to shut down a fundraising concert that was sponsored by Students for Sensible Drug Policy and NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, in Montana. The DEA came and showed them Biden's law and said, you better think twice about having this concert if people are going to be using drugs there. So they didn't have it. So that's obviously, that obviously has a chilling effect on the exercise of First Amendment rights.
And wait, I'm sorry, we're almost out of time. So talk about the Patriot Act, because we've already covered his role in getting us into Iraq War II on this show pretty extensively. But tell us about his role in writing the Patriot Act real quick, if you could.
Well, he just to say that at the time that the Patriot Act was passed, he bragged that he basically wrote it, but that it had been legislation he'd been pushing since 1994 or so. There was basically the same provisions. So he had, by no means had any misgivings about it. This is stuff before, 9/11, before, the terrorist attacks. He was pushing, increased surveillance authority, less protection for Fourth Amendment rights.
Yeah.
In the article I mentioned a bunch of other issues where there's a consistent pattern where whatever he perceives as a threat to either national security or public safety, he can be counted on to panic about it and to introduce legislation that is really short-sighted. He doesn't, think about the downside, what the unintended consequences might be. Mm-hmm. And he shows he has changed his position on some of these issues, but he has shown no sign of reconsidering that general stance of having this knee-jerk reaction to whatever he perceives to be a threat or a crisis.
Right.
And that's what really alarms me, because I don't think he's going to go back to being, a vehement drug warrior. I don't think the Democrats would let him. But I worry about all the other stuff he might do, given how mindless he is in his approach to public policy. They should have had Larry David play him instead of Sanders, where he's just going around apologizing to everybody all the time about how he spent his entire life, Anyway, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I got to interview your buddy Matt Welch here about the case against the other guy. So thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate talking to you again, Jacob. No problem. Take care. All right, y'all, that's Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine, Reason.com, the case against Joe Biden. Joe Biden's politics of panic. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.